Thank you, girls, for that beautiful prayer. And thank you to our worship leaders today. I didn't want to brush by without bringing some acknowledgement to what we remembered 8 days ago, the 19th anniversary of September 11, the day that shocked the world. We live in a very different world today. The post-September 11 world is a very different world than the pre-September 11 world. And it was, of course, if you're old enough to remember and live through that experience, you resonated with many of the questions that arose at that time. How long is this world going to last? Today we're going through a similar transition, but it's not the tragic events that befall on a single day, but it's as if it were the compounding of a daily burden in which we recognize that much of what we have taken for granted has been altered permanently. Recently, I came across a story of Cheryl McGinnis, someone who lived through the events of 9/11. It was in that morning, where Cheryl's husband, Tom, got up early and he went off to work before dawn. But he kissed his wife before he left, as he often did. A couple of hours later, she got her teenage son and daughter to school and then returned home to go about her day. She received a phone call from a friend asking if Tom was home. Then another phone call. She thought that something was up, but when she pressed her friend, the response was, "A plane has been hijacked." Tom was a pilot for American Airlines. For the next few hours, Cheryl's house was filling with friends, with neighbors and other pilots, with people from their church, and they were unable to get answers or to hear from Tom until a car pulled up, and it was the chief pilot of the airline. His mouth moved, as it were, in slow motion when the words came out that the American Airlines Flight 11, the one which Tom had been the co-pilot with, was the first plane that crashed into the World Trade Center. Years later, Cheryl published a book entitled Beauty Beyond the Ashes, where she records her personal experience after the tragedy. And she writes, "As unfair, unreasonable, and impossible as it seems, we still have work to do after a tragedy occurs. We still have roles to fill. We still have responsibilities to family and others. The stuff of life may pause for a while, but it doesn't stop. Fair or not, that is reality." But it was in the midst of Cheryl's pain and uncertainty where she discovered some of her greatest growth. She planned Tom's funeral, and this shy woman even spoke at it, which was something far out of her comfort zone. In the years after her husband's tragic death, she grew in the area of public speaking. She took care of her children and running the house as a single parent, but she learned how to approach the challenges of life with determination and with strength. She writes also, "I am learning more each day. The circumstances of 9/11 have forced me to examine who I am, to face myself in ways that I never had to before, and to ask, what does God want for me? I am learning more about myself and about God." On the 10th anniversary since 9/11, she was asked about the tragedy. She says, "It's a terrible day that I don't think anybody can ever forget, but," she added, "out of the ashes of September 11, out of the rubble of that day, I can emerge to say that I am a stronger person today than 10 years ago." You see, friends, Cheryl found healing when she found her worth. She found healing when she found her worth. What the world needs today is the same thing that it needed 19 years ago, the same thing that it needed 2,000 years ago, and that is an authentic experience with the grace of God. We today are living through a time where we do not see what it will look like at the end of this pandemic or what we are facing today in this world. And so we as God's people and the world at large is in great need of an understanding, the proper perception of the grace of God. And I would like to speak with you today about worth. The songwriter Stuart Townend says this in his song, "How deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that He should give His only Son to make a wretch His treasure." And as he reflects upon the cross upon which the Son of God hung, he says, "It was my sin that held Him there." It's almost as though he sees that it was an illegitimate exchange. You see, the basis for God's grace is rooted in something much deeper that I didn't know. The root of grace is determined by what you value most. And here's really the punchline of today's message. The value of an object is determined by the one who's willing to pay the price. You see, the root of grace is determined by what you value most. You recognize that most of the decisions or the action steps that we take in life are governed by what we find worth doing. The idea of worth means that there is an exchange that takes place. And you know how it is. When you go to a car lot, you're looking for a car, you buy a car, the sticker says $20,000. You make the determination that car is not worth $20,000. In other words, we ask ourselves the question, is there sufficient return for this price? And it is, as it were, for anything. Anything that you're going to buy, we gauge and we measure in terms of worth. Is this worth buying? In December, some friends and I visited Las Vegas. After dinner one evening, we were walking by some of the shops in the forum of the Caesars Palace Hotel. And there's a series of shops where it was obvious to me this is probably where the high rollers come and hang out. But we were walking by what was a men's clothier. Have you ever heard of that? It's just a men's clothing store. But it was a clothier. And I just happened to walk in there, and I was browsing, and there on the shelves were just beautifully displayed these shoes. And I saw a pair of shoes there, nice shoes. I'm thinking, I could probably use some nice shoes for church. And I picked it up off the shelf with a nice dressed lady after she greeted me coming in. And I saw those shoes, and I was like, wow, that's cool. I looked underneath, there was no price underneath. And I looked there in the sole, and there it was. No, that has to be a typo. Are you ready for this? $500. That's like, no way. Now, it wasn't this shoe, you understand. We went to a watch where they were selling watches, watch store. Walked in there, and behind and under this glass, I saw these watches retailing, are you ready for this? $2,500. As a matter of fact, they're not even called watches. It's called a timepiece. It's a timepiece. It's not even a watch. And I walked away from that store and from those stores thinking, first of all, two convictions. Number one, people spend way too much on some of this stuff. The second thing was, you know what? It hit me. They're open for business. People go shopping there. There's actually people that look at that and say, oh, $500 for a pair of shoes? Oh, I'll take 2. And it hit me that is worth. In other words, the value of an object is determined by the one who's willing to pay the price. But it not only is this apply for money, it also works in time. In other words, some of us and some of our young adults after high school or after college may ask, is it worth pursuing my master's degree? Is it worth it? In other words, we balance the pros and the cons based on the time that it will cost you. And you ask, is this worth it? Not only is it true for time and money, it is true also in terms of effort. You are involved in a relationship, and perhaps that relationship is strained. And you ask yourself, is this relationship worth it? Is it worth trying to save this relationship? That could apply in a dating relationship. It could apply with son or a daughter, with brother or sister, heaven forbid, even with a husband or a wife. But eventually, the stress and the burden of that relationship, we ask, is this worth it? You see, the rhythms of life that we live with every day is that we are making value judgments just about every decision that we take. Is it worth it to me? That's why we daily should ask ourselves the question that Cheryl asks, what does God want for me? And so the value of an object is determined by the one who's willing to pay the price. Turn with me in your Bible, if you have it, there where you are, to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. Matthew, the first book in the New Testament, chapter 13. Here in Matthew 13, it records 2 of the shortest parables that Jesus told. Why did Jesus teach in parables? His disciples asked him that. Jesus' answer is very interesting as to why he taught in parables. You see, in short, what he said to his disciples is that even though the people are seeing, they don't see. The people may be hearing, but they don't hear. And they don't understand. And so Jesus had the almost seemingly impossible challenge of trying to communicate the incommunicable to people who had no reference point. And so Jesus would try to break down the complexities and the realities of the kingdom of heaven and try to help people understand who were steeped in a world of sin, who all they knew was sin and perversion and oppression and murder and rape and poverty. And Jesus is trying to take the glories of heaven and help them understand. And that's why Jesus would often say, when he would begin a parable, he would say, the kingdom of heaven is like. And there the disciples would await with bated breath. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. Huh? And Jesus would try to take the incommunicable and try to communicate it in a way that they could. But notice what it says in Matthew chapter 13 and verse 15. When Jesus is addressing why he spoke in parables, he said this, "For the hearts of this people have grown dull." The NIV says, their hearts have become calloused. Their ears are hard of hearing, their eyes have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn so that I should heal them. And so Jesus tried to take the incommunicable, the riches and the glories of heaven, and had the challenge of trying to communicate that to a people who had no point of reference for it. And then Jesus would say, This was the very point. You see, my friends, Jesus was addressing a people, much like it was then, it is today, whose hearts have become dull or calloused. When I was learning to play the guitar, I had to go through the painful experience of building calluses on my finger because of the steel string guitar. It was better to build firmness or calluses so that you wouldn't feel or be as sensitive to the pain. It's okay for the fingers to be calloused, but it's not okay for the heart to be calloused. And there are many of us who have literally probably heard thousands of sermons in our lifetimes, and yet fundamentally we are still the same. Nothing has changed, and we have heard over and over and seen, and Jesus says the people's hearts have become calloused. And then Jesus breaks right in the middle of the chapter 13. He communicates these parables, these very short parables that help explain the grace of God. You see, Jesus knew the very principle was true. And it was very true what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 2:9. Eye has not seen, nor ear heard, neither has it entered into the heart of man the things that God has prepared for them that love him. In other words, we have no idea. You can't imagine. So imagine the burden of trying to take the incommunicable to those who have no idea. And Jesus does that just now. Notice what it says in Matthew chapter 13. That we're going to be looking at two parables, verses 44 through 46. Notice what it says. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again. And then in his joy went and sold all he had and bought that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. Jesus is here addressing now his disciples, also with people, as he was surrounded by this crowd and he was sitting on this boat. And he speaks of these two parables in terms of worth. Notice the first one. Verse 44 says that the kingdom of heaven is like treasure that is hidden in a field, which a man found and then hid. So here's the shortness of this parable. Jesus is capturing the realities of this. A man is taking a stroll out in a field. And as he is walking, he comes and he bumps into something. And wait a minute, what is this? Begins to dust. Oh, there's something there. There is something here. He comes across something and he stumbles across a box, a chest. What? Huh? Let me see this. Jesus describes that he finds this treasure and then he hides it and he goes. What does he go home to do? The scripture tells us that when the man found it, he hides it again. Why? He's going to go home and liquidate all of his assets. Perhaps calls his family, if he has one, his friends. Hey, I'm about to make the investment of my life. There is a property out there, and I'm going to buy that field. Back in Bible times and old times, when people would have their riches or they would have treasures, you understand that they didn't have banks back then with safety vaults. And so you couldn't keep often your treasure in your home. That was unsafe. And so people often who had property, or there would be property that would be bought, they would bury their treasure in the ground because there it would be safe. And there they would, if they happened to return to make another investment or something, the treasure, they would know where to go. But it often would be the case that if the owner of the treasure died and nobody knew about it, it would remain hidden in the ground, in that field. And so here, all we know from this story is that a man is walking through a field and stumbles, as it were, upon treasure. And when he sees this treasure, he knows immediately that he needs to buy that field. So the man does the honorable thing. I mean, I asked myself, why didn't he just take the treasure? Well, he knew that there was a sense of responsibility that belonged to that field, so he's going to go buy the field. Well, his friends who are well versed in real estate said, wait a minute, that is cheap dirt over there. It is not worth what you are going to pay. He says, yeah, but you don't understand. There's something about that field that I must have. Real estate agents, often when we had this done with us when we were looking to buy a home, they would tell us, this part of town, this is cheap dirt. This part of town over here, this is more expensive dirt. In other words, real estate is worth more in this side of town, depending on what may be there or what may not be there as opposed to the other. And so here, he buys the field. Why? Because there is treasure there. And the Bible tells us there in verse 44 that after he hides it, that for joy he went and he sold all that he had. That is the only emotion recorded in these parables. Joy. Remember that. He goes and he sells it for joy, and he goes and he buys that field. Verse 45 and 46 record the other. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search or seeking fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great price or great value, went and sold all that he had and bought it. What is the point with these two parables? My friends, this is something that teaches me about God's grace that I didn't know. You see, we understand about what God's grace, we often hear that God's grace is freely given, and it is. That God's grace is able to forgive and to cleanse, and it is. That God's grace actually may be the power that gives you victory over sin, and it is. But there is something about grace that I didn't know, and it comes back to this idea of worth. The idea of worth is that you will only exchange, as the worth is that there is an exchange for something that is valued. And for these, the man who comes across the field and the treasure, and the man who finds that pearl, there is something about those two things that compel them to have to sell everything and to go. And so now here's the man who is walking through the seaside, and he finds this merchant in the marketplace, and there he's selling pearls. And he says, you know what? Can I see that pearl right there? This one right here? Yeah. And the merchant gives it to him, and here the man seeking pearls says, wow, I'll take this one. No, you don't want that one, sir. You don't want that. Listen, that pearl. No, I want this pearl. How much is this pearl? What is it worth? And the market owner says, hey, listen, that pearl, that's too much for you. That'll cost you everything. What is it? Well, that pearl there, sir, will cost your life. That'll cost your life. In other words, it cost everything. And here, this merchant who is seeking fine pearls says, I'll take it. Why? Because there was apparently something about it that it was worth selling everything and buying that for. My dear friends, there is something powerful in the scriptures that teaches us that there is something about the gospel that is worth giving up everything for, yes. But the primary interpretation or understanding of these parables, we have to understand in the context of the rest of the parables. And that is this. In chapter 13, when there's another man out in the field, it is referring to the Son of Man. You see, we often take these parables to mean that I stumble upon the gospel in my life, And it is so beautiful and sublime in its purity and life-changing that I am willing to give up everything to attain it. And the gospel is that which we often, as it may be, that we give up everything for. Well, that is an interpretation of it. But let me submit to you today, and Ellen White tells us in Christ Object Lessons, that there is a dual application to these parables. Not only does it refer to one who comes upon the gospel and is willing to give all for it, but in its primary sense, it is referring to the heavenly merchant who comes across and walking upon a field and, as it were, stumbles upon this box. And when he opens it, he sees that there is treasure in there, something worth giving everything for. You see, my dear friends, worth has to do not only with what you are giving up in exchange for something, but what God counted as worth giving up His eternal existence for. We are told in the book 2 Corinthians chapter 5, some of the powerful truths about what God has put in each of us. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And it talks about that though the treasure that what we have, in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians, that what we have is that what we have within is that which is the glory of God. You see, we must all appear, as it were, the Bible tells us, verse 7 tells us, it's chapter 4, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7 says, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. What is that treasure that is in earthen vessels? Verse 6 tells us, it is the God who commanded the light to shine out of darkness, who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus. And this, he says, we have this treasure in earthen vessels. That means that you and I are the box or the container which contains the treasure that God gave everything for. Do you remember what the man who was walking in the field felt when he sold his treasure? When he sold all that he had to buy that treasure? Do you remember what it said about him? That in joy. Notice what the Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews, chapter 12 and verse 2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the, what, everyone at home? Joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The Bible tells us that as Jesus was hanging upon the cross, as this great exchange was taking place, that there it was for joy that he saw what was set before him. And what was set before Jesus while he was hanging upon the cross? God in His infinite mercy and grace allowed His Son to have a glimpse of all those redeemed who would be purchased by His sacrifice. And even though Jesus could not see beyond the portals of the tomb upon the cross, He would see that what His sacrifice or what His death would bring was well worth in the lives of those who would be saved. You see, beloved, the thing about worth when it comes to God is that the value of this object was determined by the one who was willing to pay the price. God valued you and me more than his eternal existence. And what an awesome thought that is. You see that the Son of God would rather go to hell for you and for me than to live in heaven without you. How deep the Father's love for us. And this is what Jesus was trying to communicate, the incommunicable about the grace of God. And so what we need today, my dear friends, is to have an authentic experience. We need to meet our God once again. We need to meet Him anew. We need to have a new experience in who He is. Here's a heartwarming story that I'd like to share in closing. Pictured here are Braden and Laura Faganello. Oh, this couple was married in July of 2016. But they were not far into their wedded bliss when tragedy struck. Just 9 months after they were married, Laura had an accident that would forever change their lives and their marriage. She was out with some friends working to get preparing for some outdoor event. And they were under some tent and they were setting up tables. And one of those steel poles that were holding up the tent became loose and it fell. And Laura says, the only thing that I remember was the sound of the pole hitting my head. A rush of panic came over people. They thought that she could probably rise and come okay, and she actually stood up with her eyes misty. They thought that she would be able to recover on the spot okay, but it was determined that she had suffered actually a severe concussion and would probably have some brain damage. What happened to Laura is that she had slipped or had lost much of her long-term memory after the steel pole had struck her head. And it took place that her husband, Braden, remembers the pain of having to go through that. After she came home, the next vivid memory that Laura has is waking up in the morning and screaming in panic because she forgot who that man was lying next to her. Braden had become a stranger. She didn't know who he was. She remembers living in a fog. She had lost memory not only of who he was, but she had lost the memory of meeting him, the memory of falling in love, and the memory of marrying him. She writes often in Facebook posts, she was detailing some of the hardest years of her life as she was trying to make sense of this. And Braden, now faced with the possibility of this wife of his who might end it because she didn't know who he was. He did everything he could to try to serve her, to be of support to her. Braden Faganello says, I felt completely trapped in a life that I was living. She would not reciprocate much of the heart or much of the love and touch that I was trying to give. I was living heartbroken as I was trying to be of support to my wife who had no idea who I was. He lived in that suspended state for almost 2 years. He says, I often consider deeply the idea that we just may as well end it, and she needed to start her life all over again. Not only did Laura have to learn how to write and to read again, but she had the complexity of having to make sense of who this man was who had, a couple years before, had said the words, I do, too. And so Braden did the only thing that he could think of doing, and that was to date her all over again. He courted her. They went out, they would enjoy some time and trying to win her over again a second time. And she noticed that through his patient endurance, through his perseverance, even in her moments and setbacks with pain and so forth, that Braden was constantly there, constantly offering hope, constantly offering support. He was, as it were, the doctor who was primary focus was her being the patient. And in August of 2019, after they had rekindled a new relationship, Braden proposed to Laura again. And it was in July of this year, 2020, on their anniversary, 4 years after they had said and exchanged their vows of I do, this couple on their anniversary exchanged those words again. I do. After this husband had gone through the effort of trying to get his wife to know him again. My friends, what I believe that God has gone through in being that one who has paid and given all because you and I were worth the very eternal existence of God. He wants us to come to know Him again, to get to see Him anew, and to rekindle a relationship with Him that perhaps up to this point we have not known. You see, the reality is for many of us that we value or gauge our worth based on what others think of us. We value or gauge our worth based on the money that we have or don't have. We value or gauge our value or worth based on the relationships or broken relationships that we may have had. And we wonder if I am even worth it. And so we use everything around us and the circumstances that we face to be the measuring stick for our worth. But Jesus tells you today that is not where your worth lies. Your worth is that I have given all for you. And God found it worth the price. Today, as our worship leaders come to lead us in this song, I want us to reflect on the words of this song and let it be an opportunity and a prayer to say, Lord, let me come to know you again. Let us sing together. Thank you for tuning in and for joining us for worship at Atholton. Even in the midst of a pandemic, the Atholton Church is serious about fulfilling the mission of Jesus, which is to take the everlasting gospel to a dying world. And more so than ever, we need that today. We want to thank you for your prayers and your support during this time to help us accomplish that mission. To partner with us, go to the website that's on your screen, and there you can give toward our local church ministries. There you can also give your tithes and offerings and help support the mission that is taking place here. You can also help fund our audio and visual technology fund, which we are so heavily leaning on during these times. We appreciate you for joining us today. Thank you for being a part of our family, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.